Hey everybody, Dr. Steviano here with another argumentation video for my argumentation course for Unit 3. In this unit, we're talking about fallacies, which is everybody's most exciting. I think most people think an argumentation class is probably primarily about the fallacies, but the fallacies have a lot of problems and a lot of concerns with them. And I think it's important that we investigate some of the trouble with the fallacies. So, in order to do that, the essay, let me bring it up here. This is the essay that we were talking about. The Fake, the Flimsy, and the Fallacious Demarcating Arguments in Real Life, published in Argumentation 2015 by Martin Boudry, Fabio Paglieri, and Massimo Pigliucci. This is a great essay. I hope you read it. I'm not going to do the entire essay for you. I think you should go and read it because they're able to do in text something that you can't do in speech. Speech and text are not laterals. So what they're able to do on the page, I can do in voice. But what I can do is raise questions and point out some of the more interesting things about their argument. So let's get into the discussion of this essay. Here are the things that the authors want to talk about. Are the fallacies structured correctly? Do we have a good grasp on how they really are formed? Do the fallacies help us in argument? What benefit do they provide to us in argumentation? Do they help us do something or avoid something bad, or what? What do they do for us? And would we be better off without them? Is there something else we could do instead, or do we need them? So this is kind of a weird approach because most people think of the fallacies as things you got to learn that you can use as weapons in a debate or in an argument that will dismiss categorically types of arguments. Broad swath, kind of like a scythe, like taking out the wheat, like harvesting the wheat with this giant curved blade. That's the way a lot of people think about the fallacies. That is the dream. And there's a lot of good reasons to have a dream like that. And that's what they talk about in this essay. So here's a couple of things that you need to be aware of what they mean. Excuse me. Deductive claims, inductive claims, and a silver bullet. So deductive claims in an argument are when you go from type to specific. So a deductive argument is when you have something that you know is true in a general sense or in a very vague kind of larger sense, and then you run a case through it, and if the case matches it, then it's true. It falls into the pattern of that deductive argument. So this would be things like if somebody has a sore throat and congestion and a headache, they have an infection. And so you would deduce from those things when a patient presents as well, you would deduce it. That's kind of a simple example, but that's a deductive claim. Inductive claims, on the other hand, are when you go from specifics to general. So this would be like the way an archaeologist might reason, or somebody who's a forensic anthropologist might reason. They would say, well, we found across, well, maybe not a forensic anthropologist, but it's when you find case after case after case, you sort of induce what happened. So case after case after case, you find commonalities, and from there you draw a general conclusion. So inductive reasoning and formal logic is you have 20-something cases, so then you have to conclude that what they all have in common must be the truth. And these two different types of reasoning they talk about through the essay, so I thought you might want to know kind of the basics of what those things are. And they talk about the silver bullet. Now, what do they mean by this? They say it would be wonderful to have a silver bullet to deal with all kinds of problematic arguments that are harmful, particularly in what they call pseudoscience, which they're talking about astrology, anything pseudoscience, astrology, horoscopes, the things that Carl Sagan hated. Anything about crystals or herbal remedies and things like that. So things about pseudoscience, anti-vaxxers, things like that. That's what they say is the attraction of the fallacies. It would be nice to dismiss those claims with one gesture and be done with them, and then they would go away. And we see this all the time. People are like, well, it's a fallacy, and then they end the conversation that way. They don't feel that that's the most productive way to go. They talk about the fallacy fork. The fallacy fork is an important idea for this essay, which is the two-pronged solution here. Anytime it's a fork, it's not like a fork you eat with. It's like it splits into two. That's what they mean by the fork. So fallacy 4, deductively constructed fallacies are easy to spot but rarely appear. So in textbooks, if you go and look at anything, or if you go online and search the fallacies, they're going to give you a form, a deductive form, and all the examples are going to be obvious to that form. They say the examples are impoverished because they leave out the things that make argumentation possible. Uncertainty, contingency, differences of opinion, differences of belief, what Tyndale called in the book the shared frame of reference, the cognitive scene, or what Wayne Brockreedy calls the optimal frame of reference in his Where is Argument. So that's an important part of it too. So that's left out. And so they're very easy to identify in a textbook or in a workbook or something like that. But in the real world, they are everywhere. And if we want to identify them everywhere, we have to give up our normative rules. What does it mean for something to be normative? A normative rule is a suggestion of how something should be. So a normative rule is this is how the economy should act. Like normativity is this idea of defining things in terms of what they ought to be. So when we say a fallacy ought to look like this, we're really kind of carving away some of the most interesting parts of the way people argue. So that's what they mean by that. So they are very concerned that fallacies in the real world are hard to spot. And when you do spot them and call them out, it usually collapses the argument into name-calling, into something even worse than committing a fallacy. So let's look at some of their examples here. The post hoc fallacy. I'm going to bring myself into the little picture here. I hope this is okay with you guys. Post hoc fallacy. This is a fallacy of coexistence implies causation. So post hoc ergo propter hoc means because of, therefore, because of, right? So two things coexist, so you want to argue one causes the other. Just because two things appear simultaneously doesn't mean one causes the other. So they are talking about it in terms of ad hominem, which is very strange. They get all their fallacies a little mixed up. But they're saying this isn't necessarily a fallacy. So for example, if you find out your physician is compensated by the pharmaceutical company of the drugs they're prescribing to you and they tell you to take, shouldn't you be suspicious, or is that fallacious? It's not, maybe not necessarily because they're compensated they give it to you, right? You might need it, and both of those things exist. What about somebody who works for the Cato Institute, which is a well-known libertarian think tank, says that the public school funding increases are bad? I mean, is it a post hoc to say that that's not a believable argument because they work for Cato? At best, we're dismissing arguments that deserve a second look or a deeper look. At worst, we're committing a fallacy ourselves, or we're committing a worse error against reasoning by taking these things on without deeper consideration. Let's look at the next one, ad ignorantium. This is one of my favorite ones. Appeal to ignorance, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So this is one that I think is kind of confusing. But they say this might not necessarily be the case. They talk about satanic memories, which is kind of a weird example. I think it's kind of a fun example, though, talking about Satanists. So if somebody says that they have repressed memories of being in a satanic cult, the argument might be, well, these are just invented to deal with another trauma because there's no evidence of a satanic cult ever being around for this person. So is that a fallacy? That's an ad ignorantum by deductive reasoning, but within the context and the situation and the things that we know, it's a remote possibility. So one of the things about this essay that's powerful to me is that instead of treating fallacies as a bomb that you detonate and it ends the possibility of argument on that topic, it reduces the claim to something that's a more remote possibility than other explanations, so the conversation can continue. I think the fallacies are used as a way to shut down argument is the wrong way, and I think that they agree with me on that. So in that one, appeal to ignorance seems like a way to diminish that claim, to say, well, no, you weren't really part of a satanic cult, something else is going on here. What about the fossil record? So creationists will always point to the lack of in-between species to argue against evolution. They'll say, well, there's no fossil record to support evolution. But this ad ignorantum, the authors say, is okay, because they have an explanation of how the fossil record works. So absence is indeed evidence of it, because those changes would have to happen very quickly. Stephen Jay Gould, a paleobiologist or paleontologist, is that the word? Talked about punctuated equilibrium, which is that when there's a necessary evolutionary adaptation, it happens very quickly. And in geologic time. But also another argument of why absence of evidence is evidence in this case is the particular conditions by which fossils are created are not easy to find. So it would make sense that they are not present. What about alien abductions? We don't have any kind of anything but grainy evidence for this. Again, this is one, or communist or the QAnon people. This is one that if we dismiss it, we wind up in more problems because we're not engaging the thought process of either one of why this is the thing that's being believed. It would be better to minimize the claim or question the internal workings of it, like in the 1950s when people like communists have infiltrated the government, and then the conspiracy theory takes over by saying, well, obviously we're not going to find evidence of it because the communists have covered it up. Just like the QAnon people are like, well, of course there's no evidence. Or of course these, Q has to operate very quietly. It has to operate in the shadows. They can only give us so much information. So these things are things that people say the absence of evidence is evidence. So they use that absence as evidence. It would be better not to accuse them of this and in the conversation, but to look deeper into the contextual clues, the situational things, and talk about those and argue there. It's messy. It takes time. It's frustrating. And that's why fallacies continue to exist, because of the attraction of a silver bullet where it's like, well, I don't have to deal with these idiots. But unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have to, is what these authors are saying. Next one, the genetic fallacy. Since the argument is from a bad or discredited kind, it's bad again. They talk about things that are really ad hominem. But I guess ad hominem is a kind of a genetic fallacy and also kind of an ad hoc. So part of the problem here is the fallacies are hard to define in reality because there's so many different kinds they could be. And if you've identified a fallacy, that it just ends the conversation, and we don't learn more about the connections the person made. If Stephen Toulmin is right about the importance of the warrant and the warrant being ideologically rooted and unexpressed, it's going to take a lot of digging to get to the connections that people make about the argument. So a fallacy does not help the digging. The fallacy cancels the dig. When you accuse someone of a fallacy, it's like game over, right? So the genetic fallacy. So religion, belief in religion is completely, any kind of religious argument that God did something or a miracle happened, we can completely discredit that because there's just no evidence of God or da-da-da. Well, they say that, is it a genetic fallacy to say religion is... Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Well, I guess you guys didn't experience any kind of pause, but I wanted to find the part in here where they talk about the genetic fallacy. So the important thing is that scientific accounts for religious experiences compete with supernatural ones. Is this God operating in our mind? And a lot of people will dismiss as a genetic fallacy any kind of religious argument because it comes from a religious source, because it comes from this idea of a divine God or something like that. Likewise, people will dismiss science in the same way as being from that source. But what they claim is that it's really just a diminished account, right? So it's perfectly understandable, even if no gods exist, it still is a fine thing to believe in. But what we have to look at is the origin of it. Origins don't dismiss a belief. The belief might have other ways of accounting for it. So the most important line here is conclusive proof is hard to come by for fallible creatures such as ourselves, even with the best tools of science at our disposal. So I think that this is pretty important for when you try to say that like that argument is bad because its origins are religious or its origins are scientific. It's not really good enough because the argument could still be true or the belief still could be supported, but maybe not supported in your preferred way. Then they talk about Ouija boards, which is kind of weird. They talk about how, hang on, let me put it up here. Ouija boards. So people who are skeptics of the Ouija board say, no, it can't be spiritual. It's this isomotor effect where people do believe that they are not moving their hand, but then they do move it in this weird kind of psychological kind of effect. The squirrel just took a tumble out there. Does not look good for him. So is that a genetic fallacy when we say, well, because it's this kind, we have to look at it? Well, we have to kind of discredit it. We have to kind of examine it to see if that connection really does dismiss the argument. They do feel like they're not moving it. It's just better explained. So a lot of times, out-of-body experiences is also a good example that they talk about too. So lab results don't diminish these experiences or say they're not true. Lab results say there's a better explanation than the immediate explanation that occurs. So really, again, the fallacy doesn't help us. It just puts two different explanations for something in competition. And then we have to kind of work out what we think the best or the most reasonable explanation is. I think this is where they say some really good stuff about, this is a great paragraph. I think we should look at it together. In many instances where the specter of the genetic fallacy is raised, it turns out to be a red herring, an illegitimate shortcut to dismiss a valuable argument. It's much more valuable to keep things complex rather than simple. The idea in argumentation that a lot of people have is that it's time for you to go in like a bulldozer and dominate and destroy your opponent. That's not what argumentation is about. Argumentation is about discovery and figuring things out and wondering if we have the best understanding of things. This perfectly illustrates the problem with the practice of labeling some arguments as fallacies. The label itself, often italicized or capitalized, suggests some sort of established philosophical result, which would make any further intellectual effort unnecessary. The message is, we all know there's such a thing as a genetic fallacy, we know it's wrong. So this shuts down what argument's supposed to do, in my opinion. And they say it's in the eye of the fallacy's in the eye of the beholder. So these are arguments, really. So if a fallacy isn't a silver bullet, it's just another way of kind of arguing, is what they're saying here. It's another way to argue. And it's something that you have to defend and you have to explain, and you don't want it to shut things down or you're not going to understand. Now, then they go on to something which is going to make sense for us later in the course, which is pragmadialectics. So pragmadialectics is a theory that says here are 10 rules for a critical discussion that is designed to solve a difference of opinion. So you and another person or in a group, you have a difference of opinion. This is how to do it. And they try to use pragmatics to get out of the deductive problem. So if you remember, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about how since Hamblin in 1970, who you're also going to read in this unit, I'm going to talk about Hamblin in another video. Hamblin's first chapter is about the received view of fallacies and the problems with the deductive view. Since that time, since 1970, the solution has been, for the most part, to try to make a pragmatic theory of fallacies. That is, it's something about the way they're used or the way it's deployed. So we're getting away from a stock, set in stone kind of mode for fallacies and more to one that is more performative. So this is what they're going to say, could this avoid it? Are these good fallacies? So the fallacy is, if you violate a rule, or you deliberately try to frustrate a rule, and the discussion continues, that's a fallacy, because if the rules are violated, you are no longer having a critical discussion. So that's something to think about when we get there. Here are the questions that I want you to think about for this reading. If fallacies are well hidden in daily life, what's the value of teaching them? What's the value of knowing the fallacy rules if they're so well hidden that they don't even meet the normative construction of deduction that you'll find when you look at them in Wikipedia, or you look at them online, or you look at them in an argumentation textbook? What's the value of them if they're so well hidden? Why would we teach them like that? Secondly, is a fallacy a good way to argue? Are these positive things? Should we use them as ways to argue? Should it be in your argument toolbox? Are these things that you could use in a way? And the ending of the essay discusses this. At the end of the essay, they say, wouldn't it be better if we use the fallacies not as a shortcut to deal with bad arguments and create more bad arguments, but what about a call for clarification? Instead of a sword, what about a call to clarify? There's something about this argument I don't like, and it's somewhere around this connection. Then the argument is more focused instead of shut down. That's what they say. So think about that. Is it a good way to argue? Is it something you should use? And then what's the difference between a fallacy and just being wrong or offering an incomplete argument? This is probably the best question. This is the question I think about a lot when I think about the fallacies is, what's the difference between committing a fallacy and just being straight up wrong, or being misinformed, or just having bad information? I think the difference is a fallacy is like an error, like a serious philosophical error that means you're an idiot. And being wrong is a mistake that could be corrected given some time and attention. So that is all that I would like to say about this essay. They have a bunch more in there that I didn't cover. I just wanted to cover some of the basics of it. But this is a great essay about fallacies and the problem with thinking that fallacies are rules for arguing. They're not. In fact, they might disrupt a much better and a much more robust mode of argumentation that really advances our thought. And, look at this. Now, I like this one better. It really advances our thought and advances our way of understanding each other in disagreement.